Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. In a recent video, I talked about the officer picture here. His name is James Fowler Rusling. He served for much of the Civil War as a staff officer in the Army of the Potomac. You may recall a story, 1854 graduate of Dickinson College, started out as an officer in the 5th New Jersey Infantry in 1861, soon became a staff officer and ended as a brigadier general in 1867. Along the way, he met a number of senior commanders: George B. McClellan, Ambrose Burnside, Fighting Joe Hooker, George G. Meade, and others. At Gettysburg, in fact, Rusling served as an aide to Major General Daniel Sickles and escorted Sickles from the battlefield to Washington after the general was hit by a cannonball and had his leg mangled. Rusling also met some of the Western commanders, including Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman. Rusling writes this wonderful book. It's published in 1889. It's titled Men and Things I Saw in Civil War Days. And he shares his descriptions, his takes on the famous generals he met along the way. And so I love it because it's filled with first person accounts, his recollections of what he saw and what happened. I want to share his recollection of William Tecumseh Sherman, who Rusling met soon after the victorious Battle of Chattanooga. That's November of 1863. Rusling's description is particularly of interest to me because he references a portrait photograph of Sherman and describes it, as you'll hear shortly, as one that's of a particularly good likeness of Sherman. Even better, Rusling and his publisher reproduce the exact image in the book, and one of my friends and a fellow collector, Jerry Everts, happens to have a copy of this print in his collection. So I'm going to show it to you right now. Here's the image of Sherman that you're going to hear about when I share Rusling's reminiscence of Sherman. So let's get into it. Here's Rusling talking about Sherman. He says, I first met Sherman personally not long after our momentous victory at Chattanooga, November 25th, 1863, when he came up to Nashville to discuss and settle the great campaign of 1864 with General Grant. Later, March 1864, Grant became commander in chief of all our armies and went to Washington, and Sherman became his successor in the military division of the Mississippi, embracing all of the United States from the Alleghenies to the Rocky Mountains. Now we get into the description. General Sherman, remember this is November of 1863, was then in the prime of life, a tall, brisk, wiry man with dark reddish hair, inclining to baldness, sharp blue eyes, kindly as a rule, but cold and hard as steel sometimes, an aggressive fighting nose and mouth, considerable of a jaw, and a face a mass of wrinkles. I have his photograph still, taken at his headquarters in the spring of 1864, which is so full of wrinkles he ordered it suppressed. But I begged it of his photographer and preserved it because so faithful and lifelike, and present an engraving of it. Habitually, he wore a Western slouch hat with a simple gold cord around it and a rusty blue uniform indicative of his rank, Major General USA, but with his coat open and the lapels buttoned back. Indeed, this was the first thing that struck me on meeting both Grant and Sherman. They hardly ever wore their coats buttoned up to the throat, whereas our Eastern generals, McClellan, Hooker, Meade, etc., hardly ever wore theirs otherwise. In campaigning, Sherman usually wore only a simple blouse, but with his proper shoulder straps, of course, Like Hooker, he was noted for his high shirt collars and also, like him, was distinguished for his gamey qualities at all times and everywhere. He impressed you at once as a keen, wide awake man of affairs with a mind and will of his own, bookish, but greater than his books, a master of his profession, alert, decided, far sighted, knowing well what was needed, and resolute to do it, and also resolved everybody about and under him should know and do the same. I think he had absolutely no patience with incompetence or imbecility, and a harder man for a humbug to impose upon or a coward to deceive never breathed. So there's Rusling's description of William Tecumseh Sherman, and this photograph being the same likeness that's published in that original book. One thing I want to get to towards the end of his comments, Rusling notes that, and then here's the quote: "He's also resolved everybody about and under him should know and do the same." End quote. It struck me that Sherman, the idea that I have of him based on Rusling's description and others, is that he's tightly wound. He's a tightly wound guy, and he's keen on making sure all his plans are carried out. But that little detail here in Rusling's observation reinforces this idea that I have of Sherman as being the kind of general who really wants to make sure that he's communicating and keeping everyone in alignment. As you students of the Civil War, that is no small feat when your mode of operation is men moving about on horses, communicating mostly by messages and aids, and having a telegraph at your disposal, but not getting to use it to be exactly in the field. So there's a story, first person account of what it was like to meet Sherman, what he looked like, and how he was as a general. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.